All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of La Coalición. It's an honor to be here with you all. I have some wonderful guests here with me. My name is Educator. I'm the policy coordinator with ICIJ, and I'll pass it over to my co-host, Alejandro.
I'm Alejandro, the Coachella Valley organizer for ICAJ, and I'll pass it on to Dr. Martha.
Formerly Doctora Marta Rivas, Dr. Marta, and I'm from the desert, Inland Empire, desert Chicana, and I'm really excited and really thrilled to have this conversation with all of you.
This is going to be a really interesting conversation because it's something that within the immigrant community, within the Latino community, is a topic that sometimes our ancestors, our parents, tios and tias avoid, right? And I think it's a really important conversation to have now, especially with the context of social justice around us, right? BLM, all of these movements around us. So thank you so much, Dr. Rivas, for being here and having this really important conversation for our community. We want to open up, first of all, with the breakout question. So, Alejandro, why don't you ask us what the breakout question is, and if you can go first.
I think I'm going to make this question a bit more like open-ended. So it's either going to be, what was the first time you understood racism, or what was the first time you experienced racism?
Yeah. Well, I can go because I have one right out the top of my head, which was when I was working for the city of Moreno Valley. I used to work at a skate park, right? And I used to help out the kids, whether it was skateboarding or we had a soccer park. And one time, this kid needed help with his bike. His bike broke down, and he came over to me and asked me if I could help him. And I was like, yeah, sure, I got some tools with me, of course. And then this was like, a little white kid. He was like maybe like 10, 9 years old, and he had his buddies around him. And then he made a joke like, well, of course, like you're Mexican, like you're going to know how to fix this. And I was like, actually, like it didn't really, nobody else laughed, and I wasn't laughing either. So I was just like, okay, like I'm not gonna help you out anymore, little kid. Figure out yourself, So that was one of the first times I directly had experienced that. But throughout high school, there was a lot of tension between black and brown folks, and we had actually race riots in our high school. Vista del Lago High School in Moreno Valley, and that happened for a couple of years. So there was definitely a lot of things that happened within those couple of years that kind of shaped who I was at that time. But I eventually grew out of those, out of those negative preconceived notions of other colored folks. So, yeah, I mean, I experienced that and then experienced the city issue. And now I feel like I've been pretty safe so far, but there's all these microaggressions that happen everywhere too.
Absolutely.
They can go on forever. Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. I'll pass it to you.
I guess the first time I experienced racism, or at least the most impactful one, was like maybe my interview for my residency. I wasn't aware of like what I was wearing, I guess, or how I looked. At that time I was like 13 and chubby, so like I wore like a big jacket and pants, big jeans as well. So like, because I felt insecure about myself and all that, and the interviewer called me a gangbanger, and he ended the interview there.
Yeah.
Like he accused my mom and I about lying. Like, and the weird thing is you would imagine it being a white person, but it wasn't. It was someone of color.
Yeah.
So it was like, wow.
Yeah. No, that similar thing happened to me with one of my friend's dad, who saw us wearing shakas and shorts, right, and Converse, and they were like, "We're hanging out with my son. You guys are gangsters. We're just trying to play football with your son."
Right.
So yeah. I share that.
Yeah.
And Dr. Rivas?
I think for me, the first time that I realized there's something wrong here, like people are looking at me differently for a reason. I was young, I was 5.
Wow.
And I grew up undocumented. I tell the story. I was smuggled in when I was 3, but I grew up here, knowing very well that I was undocumented. So I was 5 years old, and I was told I couldn't go play outside because the men in green suit were outside.
Oh, wow.
And so that sort of prompted a question. It's like, what? This isn't fair. I just want to go play outside.
Yeah.
And so there was this distinction, I think, very early on for me to ask the question, how is this okay? Like, this is not okay. And so that sort of, and I'll speak to it, right? That really sparked the question of, like, why are people seen differently? And I'm just, all the men in green suits were all Latino. So how are they going to see me differently? So it was like this quest to answer those questions and really understand what's really happening here.
Wow.
And then later on, we talked about microaggressions, like these unsaid, subtle statements that are convoluted with all these racist undertones. I think that's really what we're dealing ongoing. It's a daily basis. And then once we understand what racism is really meant to do, then we encounter it every single day,
Right.
every space we enter.
Yeah.
So that's that. I mean, again, that's why we want to have these conversations, so we have that language.
Yeah, and then hopefully our audience can understand it themselves and understand that it's happening around them at their workspace, maybe within their own family as well. So we hope that this conversation can be brought home and shared with their family members as well.
Right.
Especially since it's a difficult one for most people to have. Like, you know, in 2020, like, there was more of an awareness about race and race relations, like there was back in the 90s when the LA riots occurred as well. You know, the issue is that, you know, it's not like it only occurs outside of our homes. It occurs within our homes, and we have to be aware about that and really find a way to start that conversation,
Yeah.
but not only start it, but also continue it without fear.
Yeah.
I will say racism is like the monster in the horror movie. Like,
Yeah, I often, when we talk about racism with our children, like I often say, you know, my mom used to tell me about La Llorona y el Cucuy. I'm like, that's exactly what this, it creeps up on you when you least expect it and you don't even know how to name it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we need to, like you said, some of us may have had parents or prior generations not want to. I think I often say it's not that they didn't want to, maybe they just didn't know how.
Mm.
And so for us to even sit in this space and have cameras and microphones, that's a privilege for us to be able to say, we're going to carve out the time and the space to really say, let's really talk about what this means and what is the language we need to use, because we don't want to interchangeably use one term to the other and then nos confundimos. And then the confusion just keeps prolonging and prolonging. And so, but I think that goes to the question in terms of my background, my training, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's important for folks to understand. I'm formerly a trained critical race theorist. And so I introduced myself as a Chicana critical race theorist. And that's like, whoa, what's going on here? And I think that's part of the reason why we're here in the social political sphere right now in terms of we have to ban critical race theorists. We don't talk about theory. We don't talk. And I think that's also my responsibility to talk about what I bring to this space, because I am trained to be able to speak to the evolution of this country and the history of this country, the language of this country, because it is set up to oppress intentionally. And that's what people are trying to shut us out. Like, don't talk about those issues. Don't talk about theory. I'm not talking about theory. I'm talking about history.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the historicity. So what that historicity means is, how did we experience history? How do we not just sit back and let somebody tell us what history was about, but how do we flip the script and say, okay, how did folk really experience history? Mm-hmm. And that's important. That's part of the conversation of, why did our parents not talk about this? It's like, porque les dijeron que no hablaran de esto? Like, let's not talk about this. Mm-hmm. Because then what comes of it? You know, just sadness or feelings, and it comes of it. And so I think that's the important role that we play here, is covering that space.
Yeah, definitely. And do you want to give a shout out to some of the institutions that you went to? Or,
Yeah, I mean, grew up in India, right? And after graduating Indio High School, I went to UCLA. And so I spent 15 years of my life at UCLA. So I have a bachelor's degree in Chicano Studies, a second bachelor's degree in Comparative Literature, focusing on Chicana literature. I went directly to a PhD at age 22 because of these questions, right? I have these questions and I deserve to have answers, but more importantly, my community deserves answers. Yeah. And so I went directly to a PhD at age 22, and I have a master's degree in education, focusing on the Chicana experience in higher education. And then I have a PhD, so I wrote that 220-page book, essentially, on really understanding the experiences of Chicanas who started at the community college and went all the way to the PhD. Awesome. And so that's really my field, my academic scholarship, is to really understand we can do it, we will do it, but what's really happening institutionally? How are institutions not allowing us to do it? Mm-hmm. And it's by default, I'm a historian, right? I need to understand the history of institutions. I need to understand what policies have been implemented. And part of that is understanding this legacy of white supremacy and understanding race and racism and all this big, heavy stuff that we're not supposed to know, right? And so when I say I'm a Chicana critical race theorist, it's like, primero Chicana, that's political. Y luego critical race theorist, ¿qué nos va a decir? And it's really because I embody what this country didn't want us to attain, which is knowledge.
It's even more like when you're, not just like a cis-het man, because like when you're in the space of like education, like as a person who isn't that, like you're questioned more. like you're treated, much more worse.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to circle back on the history thing because history is always written by, the victors. It's never written by the people who suffered it. It's written in the blood of them, if anything. So it's important that you're doing this work because it demonstrates that, we're given some agency, even if it's like 200 years down the line.
Yeah. Well, I feel inspired by you. Thank you so much for being here. Your journey and your story, I think that can touch a lot of people's hearts and minds because, you're there doing the good work for our community and enlightening us all on the really hard topics that we need to have, right? And so one of the first questions that we have for you to tackle those questions is how can we understand and operationalize race and racism?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all you.
I think it's important for us to make the distinction, right? Because oftentimes we run with, what is racism and we're all racist. Y le digo, back up a bit. Let's really understand the history behind this. And ultimately, it comes back to understanding that race as a category was intentionally created by European colonizers. And so the establishment of this country was to be able to say, how can we have the tools to really do the work that we need to do, which is divide and conquer and establish a society. And so that's basic way I get under and I help folk understand is like these are the categories that were created to really just put us in these buckets, if you will, to be to say, oh, black and white and native, y Latino, or on the onset. But the onset of this history in this country was they wanted to keep it really simplistic. So racial categories became simply black and white. And it was a black and white binary. To this day, we start fighting this black and white binary. Right? When we talk about racism in this country, oftentimes it's just a black and white issue. And that's why I say when I introduce myself as Chicana critical race theorist, it's like, híjoles, I'm going to interject a different discourse. I'm going to break that binary. And I say this simply because when this country was evolving, for those of you who may have been born in this country, if you look at your birth certificate, they made your parents check off the box white. And so it's that intent to saying, we're going to propagate this binary. Si no eres negro, eres blanco. And we're going to keep this really simplistic conversation about race and racism. So race as social constructs is just a label to be able to distinguish folk.
Yeah.
It's important. Data is important. So yes, we do have some, digamos, medical data that is important to disaggregate.
But the intention was
But the intent is to divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Like we need to know where to put you.
Yeah.
And then we need to know how to see you in this country. And so that see you in a certain way, that's when racism comes into play. So racism as a concept is how to essentially put power upon you. And so when we really look, and we can't remove racism within the historical context of why it was created, right? So European, white settlers said, we're going to have these categories, but why was that? Is to be able to have a way to exert oppression over you.
Yeah.
And so that racism became a structure of power.
Yeah.
And so the question became, how do Latinos have, racism among Latinos? By default, we don't have power to exert that level of racism against one another. But we do have, prejudices, we have stereotypes, we do discriminate, but that also comes from a long history of imposing this power dynamic of how we see each other. And so that's important for us to understand is that the construct of racism was white folk holding power over us.
Yeah.
And so that's how it operates. And so when we talk about institutions of higher learning, when we talk about the medical system, the legal system, the housing system, every system in this country was created with the fibers of white supremacy, of how do we protect white supremacy and oppress folk of color. Every single institution holds that ideology. And we're afraid to say it that way. And so when we actually take time to pause and say, okay, let's really think about housing, why do folks live in certain pockets? Well, we had redlining. There was laws that would prohibit people of color to move in certain neighborhoods. Healthcare access también,
Did y'all hear that? When it comes to real estate, if a community starts to become more of a community of color, it starts to decrease in value. Because supposedly it's focused on the aspect that less white people are going to want to move in that area. So when you have communities of color that try to value their homes as they should be valued, because they're still beautiful homes, that doesn't change. The only difference is the people living inside of them don't look a certain complexion or aren't a certain ethnicity.
Right.
Yeah.
So that definitely kind of still continues. We think that redlining is way in the past, but it's still going on.
Yeah. Then you have like the other side of that coin, which is gentrification, right? Where it's black and brown people being pushed out of their communities that they've lived in for decades or generations,
Yeah.
perhaps, right? Like I know some folks in Echo Park that have been living there, and they have like a beautiful skyline view of downtown Los
Right.
Angeles, and they've been there literally for 50 years, and everybody around their neighborhood has been bought off, and
Yeah.
they've been living there just as long, but like these people are coming in and they're taking over and they're pushing people out
Yeah.
to the IE,
Yeah.
you know. So we have a lot of transplants over from LA, from
Oh,
Orange County,
yeah,
and
it's gonna continue.
it's gonna keep growing.
It's
Yeah,
gonna continue. But that's also the intersectionality of racism and classism, right? And so that when we start seeing like, oh, well, money talks, and like who has access to that money, and it's still not folk that look like us often, and so that's another reason as to how does this continue to perpetuate itself,
yeah,
you know? And so I think we're gonna, but in terms of the inland, we're gonna continue to see the influx
yeah,
of people coming into the inland because they're being pushed out
yeah,
of other regions as well.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for tackling that really heavy topic. I've had that conversation with my brother about how we don't have the power, so how can we be racist? But it took a little while for him to like really understand the concept of it. But I think you did a really good job in breaking it down. So I appreciate that. Now let's move on to the next question, which is how does racism play out within the Chicano Latino culture in our community?
Yeah, so going back to even the question, right? It's this for us to understand that it's not necessarily racism as a power structure, but where did it come from? Like, why is it that we often say, well, we have some belief systems and we have some ideologies and we have some stereotypes. And some of us, I grew up in a household that my dad used to say, once my sister and I were of age to date, con tal de que no salgan con un moreno. And I was like, what the we're going to purposely go out with somebody assuming that you're imposing this heteronormative, like assuming, all these different things about who we are as young women. But the point was that there was a statement being made.
Yeah.
And it was a statement that I knew there was some fundamentally wrong. But then it's a legacy of where does this come from, right? Why did he believe, I know my dad's not racist, now that I know the language behind racism, but where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back to tools to oppress, right? Tools to oppress, to be able to say, we're going to then implement not only categories of race, and now we have a power structure to oppress you, but now we're going to make you believe this stuff. Now we're going to really make communities of color, not just in the U.S., but globally, white supremacy. White supremacy, it's the idea that whites are superior and people of color are inferior. So this is a global phenomena. And so what happens is now we have it in Mexico, Centroamérica, Latino America. And so this casting system of the whiter you are, the better off you are. So it's a subscription to, I'm going to believe this idea that the lighter, el güerito con los ojos azules, oh, qué bonito. But if you're moreno, it's, oh, man. Mm-hmm. It's like the anti-blackness was instilled purposely to really uphold this idea that whiteness is better and the European standards of beauty is better. Right. And so that's where it comes from, like this idea being like implemented across the globe is that we're going to believe this nonsense. And so then we start internalizing this nonsense. And so that meant that by default, by embracing this idea of white supremacy, we're going to have this anti-blackness. We're going to have anti-indigenous. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about, oh, mi bisabuela vino de España, but we're not going to recognize that somos purépecha. And it's that contradiction that we have to coexist. And so in that discussion of how do our communities have these ideas, have this derogatory, framework, it's because it was intentionally a way for us to subscribe to the idea that white is superior and that we are actually inferior. And it's hurtful, right? And it's hurtful in having these conversations. It's an ongoing process because then by default, what we're really asking ourselves to do is understand or ask ourselves, where did we learn this from? And if it's our parents, where did they learn it from? Mm-hmm. And if it was their generations, it's not about pointing fingers, right? It's not about, oh, es porque ellos. No, it's not about pointing fingers. It's about there was something externally heavier happening so that they would condition us. And so that we would then look at one another like, oh, pues yo soy mejor, I estoy más blanquita. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work. It's not the reality, but it was an intentional mechanism for us to really internalize some of these ideas. Yeah. And so that's when we, talk about internalized racism. Yeah. So to your question, I think it's not necessarily racism within the Latino community, but rather what are those racist ideas that have been inculcated over generations that we may say them, we may think them, but now we have a privilege to say, okay, we need to stop this because we're only dividing and conquering. We're doing what white supremacy always intended us for us to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, Alejandro, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I wanted to add, even speaking about how those power structures within our communities play, like there are some clear pieces of evidence. Like I remember Eddie, we talked about la raza cósmica like during our conversation
Yeah.
before the podcast. How that is ingrained in in Mexico, like the, you know, bettering the race or la raza, like you do that work or not do that work, but that kind of that's ingrained in the way that we interact with each other and we continue on our lineage, and that is passed down out here to the US and whitewashed differently so that we don't really fully understand because we have historical amnesia. That's
Yeah, we
that's the
spoke about
term.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard because we sometimes lose our roots because we're while our family might be from Mexico and have that history, but they don't have that education of this is like how things play out or anything like that, because it's not always made evident. It's not always like it's a space where you can talk about it. It's brought out here and then washed over, and you're starting over on a new template where you're the seed that's going to grow out here and build those roots from the other roots.
Yeah.
And it's harder. It's harder to do that work, especially since
a lot of undoing. We're talking about hundreds of years of colonialism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how can you not, because again, going back to the point I made, racism can't be removed from the historical context, right? There was an intent behind it. And so the intent of, putting us in these categories and making us believe that white supremacy is real, it was also as a result of saying, we're going to disconnect you from everything that gives you power as a persona, because everybody's born with power. We're just born into a country that makes us believe we don't have power. And so that power really is connected to our indigeneity. Our indigenous ancestral wisdom would be something that would challenge how colonial societies are being built. We don't want you to know that, so we're going to do everything we can to disconnect you from ancestral wisdom.
Yeah.
And so now we're evoking we talk about decolonize. It's like, what do we really mean by decolonizing, right? We're going to go back to indigenous ways. Well, como que no, it's not adequately accurate, but we can certainly talk about what is our root. What is our indigenous root? What is our indigenous knowledge? And it has been cut off intentionally for generations, but we're doing the work now to saying, we existed prior to colonial tactics. We existed prior to racism. We were kings and queens and thinkers and scientists and artists and poets prior to all these labels. So how do we reclaim that knowledge? How do we make sure we give voice to that experience? And then just to point on Vasconcelos, or Jose Vasconcelos, who was the philosopher who wrote La Raza Cósmica, even that, we don't take what's written and run with it. There was problems with that concept. Even when folks who do the reading, you have to read critically. Just because it's written doesn't mean it's true. And so when he wrote that, it's problematic in a way that, yes, certainly we talk about el mestizaje de la gente, right? We talk about Spanish, African, all the diversity that occurred specifically because he was Mexicano and within the Mexican region. But he also perpetuated some kind of exclusion of some folk. So también, he was perpetuating the same kind of ideas.
Right? Yeah.
So we have to be mindful with who we cite in terms of what it is that we're going to celebrate. Porque también there's shortcomings.
Yeah, it'd be your favorite sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be like, I'm going to run with it. Well,
Yeah, no.
let's go back a little bit.
Exactly. Right.
especially since being Latin American or Latino, Latinx, Latine, or even Mexican, Chicano isn't a racial thing. It's more of an ethnic identity, and or the best way you can explain it is a racial ethno-racial identity. Like sometimes race does play a part of it, but not often. But the bigger thing is ethnicity, because you grow up with this culture that is built upon food, that is built upon music, that is built upon all these other aspects that really do kind of continue on with us.
Absolutely.
Whether we like to acknowledge it or not. And it's more than just racism. It's prejudice that really impacts us.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to move on to the next topic, because I think it'll give us a real understanding here within the IE, because it's such a a mixed community. There's a lot of different people that live here, from Pacific Islanders. Shout out to my people from the Samoa, and then also the Philippines, which I grew up with a lot of people from the Philippines and Moreno Valley. So, but there is a problem within the Latino community with the Black community. So that's definitely a big, heavy topic to uncover and to touch on. But can you just talk about more about how anti-blackness is living within the Latino culture?
Absolutely, and I think it goes back to the concept of like what is the tool that we're going to make you believe so that you internalize these ideas. So the whiteness being the superior, then we're going to do the by default anti-blackness, anti-indigenous. So I don't want to just juxtapose the anti-blackness. It's also anti-indigenous, and it goes hand in hand. And so it's these ideas that we're going to devalue, and we're going to disrespect. We're going to find ways to then point fingers and say, no son mejor. They're not our equal, or they're not as good. And so we do have those tones within the Latino community. And we talk about like Afro-Latinos who are now getting recognized as part of the entire community. It's precisely because of the historic way of us devaluing, not wanting to acknowledge, complete erasure, if you may. So part of this conversation about why is there these tensions? Why is there these ideas? And it's because we've been subscribed to this idea that whiteness is superior. So the further we can not connect to that blackness, the better off we are, or we think we are, because of the subscription to white supremacy. And there's tactics, right? They're always putting black and brown folk against one another. And that's the challenge as well, because that's a mechanism to uphold white supremacy. If they fight off on their own, they're going to do the job for us. If they don't get along, that's better for the whiteness. And so I think it's a tactic. And so I think for us to be able to think of it in that way, because when we really look at history, folk of color of all spectrums, because Filipinos, you said Filipinos, they're our cousins, right? Conquered by Spain, somos primos. So when we really look at our histories, that we have far more in common than we do differences. So when we look at our commonalities, that brings unity. White supremacy doesn't want that. Right. It's that kind of like I said, that little
history is a tool that uncovers the commonness with all of the oppressed and settled on people.
And it goes back to también like, what history are we being taught? Because we're not going to see these histories in our curricula in our K-12. And that's another point, that this country is the only country in this world that mandates our little ones to be in school. From age 4 and 5 all the way to 18, you have to be in school. Otherwise, parents get in trouble and there's consequences. So we have to then ask ourselves, why is that? And what's being taught? And what's being taught is a European history, right? We start off with, who is George Washington? Everybody knows that. Who is George Washington? I always get the answer, the first president. And I sit back and say, actually, he wasn't. Because it really tells us that they're telling us a story, and they make us, force us to really believe this stuff, but they don't tell us the whole story. So George Washington was the first president in this country of our current Constitution. But he wasn't the first president of this country. So when we dig that up, the advantages of Google it, you're going to see it's 14 white men that were presidents before he was. So what does that mean for me is that we have to be vigilant. What are they teaching us, and what are they not teaching us? Because what they're not teaching us is how Black folk, Latino folk, Native folk, all folk of color, we have experienced the same form of oppression. And us pinning each other or pointing at each other and having this anti against one another is a mechanism directly from white supremacy. We're doing their job.
Yeah.
They didn't want us to come together and realize that we have far more in common, because that would mean unity, right? And it goes back to Malcolm X told us for years. It's not that we're outnumbered, it's just we're not organized. And we're now experiencing this pushback on ethnic studies, right? And people often say, and I'm sure some of our audience members are going to say, we're hearing about this pushback on ethnic studies because now in California, it's an actual requirement.
Right.
And so now we're moving forward, right? It's like we really want to teach this history. Yeah. And conservatives are pushing back, because what does that mean? It means that we're now going to teach our own kids our real history.
Yeah.
That means there's going to be a level of empowerment and respect across different communities. But the anti-blackness is real. And I think that's the responsibility we hold, to be able to say, why does it exist? And so it goes back to, if we actually look at it as a tool,
yeah,
then we can reject it.
Yeah. shout out first of all to Solimar Jose Medina, who authored the ethnic bill study. He pushed on that for
Yeah, he
years to
did.
make it a law here in California, and I think California is a much better place for it now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I can speak to some of the anti-blackness directly because my wife is black, and when we were dating, first of all, it was really interesting because she would be the only black person in the room. Most of the times, she would be the only black person in the room. We're talking like my family from Michoacan, who has never seen a black person before, so she'll not in their house, right? So it was an interesting dynamic to go through, but eventually they warmed up to her, and now they accept her fully. And at first it was a little bit rough though, because I would hear little rumblings like, "Oh, it's a good thing that she's not that dark." Like, wow, that's great.
wow.
You know, we're glad that she's, she's black, but she's not that dark, so that's good, right? And I was just be like, "No, no, that's not okay to say."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you don't understand like what you're actually saying here.
Yeah.
You know.
But it also evokes the conversation for us to say, like, well, how were we taught to believe this stuff? Like the shade, right? The shadeness of the blackness, like what's acceptable, what's not. And so it's also important for us to understand that there was a movement, called the eugenics movement in this country. So it was a group of white men scientists created fake data, but essentially data to say, folk of color are not they're not smart enough, they're not capable of learning, they're not capable of reading. They're really here just for labor.
Was it like phrenology or something?
I'm sorry?
Was it like called phrenology or something like that? I forgot what
it was. The eugenics movement. And so that spanned off to all the fields because ultimately the eugenics movement set the pillars to really define academia. So psychology, education,
Stanford
political
University
science.
was founded by eugenists.
Exactly.
Planned Parenthood started off as like,
testing. Yeah, and testing on women of color. And so the eugenics movement essentially set the foundation to say we're going to have all these ways to say they're not good enough so we could dehumanize them, right? So having them in chains and beating them up, that's okay because they tolerate pain. Experimenting on women of color, ripping out their uterus, as harsh as that sounds, that was real and it still goes on at the border. We could do that because they're of color. Or we could keep them in cages at the border right now as we speak, 2023. So there was this level of dehumanizing people of color. And so how is this connected to what our families kind of say about the race, like phenotype, the darkness, or lo que sea, is because the eugenics then created apparatuses of how do you have this propaganda? How do you convince people? Well, let's look at las novelas. Let's look at the news. Let's look at, not only that, but even in this country, like who controls all the media outlets? It's just 6 white men.
What's that guy from Sábado Gigante? What's his name?
El peruano? He was peruano.
No, he's not. He's actually German. Like his last name is something super German.
Well, that it's interesting because at the end of the day, we all have there is some connection to the European. Like I have some German great grandparents that came from Germany to Michoacan to build the railroad. And so we have to acknowledge that tenemos un poquito de todo, right? And, when I tell that to my kids and my daughter's like, we also have African blood. I'm sure we do. We all come from Africa somehow. And so, but the point I was making earlier is that how the message is conveyed is by daily reminders. So whether it be las noticias, the novelas that a lot of our parents still watch, or the curricula, what's celebrated. We're not gonna.
Why doesn't Bad Bunny date anybody besides white people?
That's what I'm saying. European
standards.
European standards of beauty. I mean, and it still goes on. Even some of the backlash of and I didn't catch up too much on it, but the young, the Mexican group from Washington.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. My mom was talking
about
that.
There was some backlash. Yes, because of some comments that she made about Mexico and
food.
And I was like, we need to keep it in context. These young children are in Washington. It's not the Southwest, so the richness of the Southwest, originally Mexico, it's not there. So the intentional disconnect from them for them not to know what Mexico is all about, by default, is a historical, unfortunate legacy. And so there's a lot of mentoring and teaching that needs to occur all over the place. Yeah. But when these examples come up, it's like, no le echen la culpa a los niños. Like there's a lot.
All right, well, we're really deep into this conversation, but we have to stop right here for the conclusion of part 1. But we will move on to part 2 in a couple of weeks. Just don't mind the clothes. We might be wearing the same clothes in a couple of weeks or so. But stay tuned for part 2. It'll be touching on the anti-indigenous ideologies within the Latino community and touching on nativity as well. So stay tuned for those conversations for part 2.